Welcome to the Mold Matters Podcast. Whether you are looking for help recovering from mold illness or just want to learn more about creating a safe environment for your family, this podcast is the place for you.
Hello and welcome to the Mold Matters Podcast. I am Jeremy Evans, one of your co-hosts, along with my good friend
Mike Adams.
Mike Adams. We're professional mold remediators, and we also do a podcast on mold. Been doing this for now, 6 months or so. I'm trying to do a couple of these a month where we share advice about mold, health, mold remediation practices, all these little things that we pick up being in people's homes every day from academic literature. And then we've started a nice relationship with Doctor Jeff Wright where we consult with him. I know we've said this before, but Dr. Wright has helped hundreds, if not thousands, of people get better from mold illnesses, and quite an expert on the protocols and things to get well from mold, and a bunch of other stuff too. We don't give you as much credit for that because our focus is mold, but a lot of the mystery illnesses, mold, as well as mold, and a lot of the common ones, which we're actually going to talk about today too. Yep. But anyways, welcome first of all, Jeff.
Nice to be here.
Welcome back. We've got a nice series of health and mold that we've been doing and are going to continue doing, because mold is so, it's just an interesting thing. As you've mentioned before, Jeff, because there are so many symptoms that are associated with mold, it is so commonly confused with other ailments. Right?
Yes.
And so we'd kind of like to, to keep parsing out what is mold, what isn't mold. Mm-hmm. And
I have a kind of a funny comment on that.
Yeah.
My wife, she gets on me a little bit. And she'll say, Mike, every illness in the world is not from mold. and I understand that, but I sure think a lot of them are, you know. But
well, you get into it, and we're seeing people who are we're going into moldy homes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And everyone we see is sick, and it usually is mold. So, but it isn't always mold. And so, but today we'd like to, we're in Utah, and it's pretty stinking cold out there. I don't know what the temperature today was. What is it?
Was it someplace south of warm?
Yeah, it was below freezing, at least in the mornings. I had to scrape my windshields, and so. But regardless of where you live, this is kind of the season for. Every year, colds, flus start to come out and happen. And so, Jeff, we'd kind of like to talk about that, if you don't mind.
Sounds great.
Like to kind of have you kind of help us understand, is it mold or is it a cold, as your wife came up with that catchy catchphrase for us.
As my beautiful wife said, is it a mold or cold? And it sounds so great, and it just kind of rolls off your tongue. And how do you know if it is mold or a cold? How do you know if what you just caught is something that you could share or not?
Yeah.
Well, I'm starting to become a poet. So anyway, I guess the easiest way to sum it up in a couple of words or not, if it gets better when you leave the house, it's probably mold. If it's self-limiting and eventually goes away, it's probably a cold. Now, symptomatically speaking, I would say that a cold might, you might get a little bit achy, and your nose might run. You might get a little bit of a sore throat. Not a really bad sore throat. That would be something else. Your nose is running. Your eyes are watering. It might look like allergies, but a cold is going to come. It's going to be self-limiting, and it's going to go away. So you think a cold is going to be, if you live in my world, 3 to 5 days. If you live in the regular world and don't do all the stuff that I do, like 5 to 7 days. Mm-hmm. And a cold, you might take some antihistamines, or you might take some cold medicines, and it'll help with the symptoms. Mm-hmm. If it's mold, it's not going to be that self-limiting 5 to 7 days, up to 10 days thing. It's going to continue. Mold is going to be more environmental, meaning if you leave for a while and it gets a little better and you go home and it gets a little worse, that's not a cold. It doesn't behave like that. It's going to be bad wherever you are.
Yeah.
A flu will give you a fever, typically.
Yeah.
Mold, if it gives you a fever, it's going to be a very mild one. Like 98.6 is the normal average body temperature for humans. If you're not a human, you don't have to listen to this.
Turn it off at home.
Yeah, turn it off at home if you're not human. Or if you're not breathing air, you should probably turn this off right now because it's not going to matter. So, a 90, let's say you have a 99, 99.2, something like that. That might be as much as mold will give you. A fever will, from a flu, will usually be a little higher than that. Now, if you normally run around 96 or 97, yes, you have a bunch of other stuff going on, but you getting a fever might actually look like now you have normal body temperature of 98.6.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. Sinus infections, or what people perceive as sinus infections. I believe I read it on the CDC website, where they've attributed a very high percentage of sinus infections are related to indoor mold. Is there a surefire way of saying this sinus infection is fungal or it's bacterial? Or, I mean, give me some background on that.
There's not an easy way to differentiate between a fungal and or bacterial and or viral sinus infection. You can run a blood test. Blood tests for sinus infections are hit and miss because you're not necessarily in the blood. It's in a open cavity. So sinuses are caves. And so what gets into the blood is what penetrates the mucosal membrane on the inside of the sinuses. So that's not as easy to nail it down that way. A sinus infection that is chronic, I would be much more likely to be right if I said it's a fungal or some sort of chronic spore-related organism as opposed to a bacterial infection. It's still tricky to figure out because it could be viral, it could be bacterial. Typically, a viral sinus infection is going to be milder, and a bacterial infection is going to be much more acute and much more intense.
So here's another question. I've thought about this for years because I run into it all the time, and I mean, I've told many people that I think if we treat your home, your sinus infection will get better. I probably shouldn't be that bold, but it seems it works out more times than not. But we see customers all the time that have told us, look, I'm on my third or my fourth round of antibiotics, and nothing seems to help. Would that be a dead giveaway that it's not bacterial?
Yes.
Okay.
Or if they have allergies they didn't used to have. There was a study at a prestigious university a few years ago, and they said the theory was, gosh, maybe chronic allergies are actually related to a fungal infection. Fungus and mold are very closely related. Maybe it's actually caused by a chronic fungal infection, and so they did 6 months of antifungal drugs, and their allergies went away. Well, what that means is it wasn't an allergy in the first place. It was actually a fungal infection that was stimulating the immune system's method to deal with allergies in the same way that it was dealing with the fungus. Took care of the fungus, the allergy goes away.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I would say, in modern medicine, we want to nail it down to the very thing that's causing you to be ill. In my practice, I found that usually the people who have one problem don't walk through my door.
Right.
Now, I specialize in the complicated stuff, so,
Right.
but almost never is it just one problem. I mean, I'm treating a young lady right now who's got a skin problem, and there's the immune reactions causing the itchy skin, as well as the bacterial organism that got infected on the broken skin, as well as the fungal infection that's there because of broken skin and happened to be there, so it's an opportunist infection. You treat the rash with something that calms down the itch, but you still didn't kill the bacteria, and you kill the bacteria, put the antibiotic cream on, they're still not getting better. Well, it's because there's multiple factors going on there that need to be dealt with. Sinus infections are no different.
So could you potentially have a bacterial infection and a fungal infection within the same sinus cavity?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you took an antibiotic the first time and there wasn't a fungal infection there, maybe there were the spores there but they haven't grown, you wipe out the competing organisms, which are the bacteria, whatever didn't die is going to grow. So if you've got some fungal spores, let's say you have some mold spores in there that aren't doing anything, and you go and wipe out all the bacteria, which are there to I like to think of it like a movie theater. There's only certain number of seats. So if you go through and wipe out all the brunettes and the redheads, then who's going to come back? Predominantly more blondes.
Right. Yeah.
Or maybe you get the skinheads who don't have any hair. The thing is so if you wipe out the competing organisms, now the flora is not balanced anymore, and whatever didn't die is going to grow. So yes, it's actually very common to have a fungal infection or a mold infection on top of the bacterial infection. And in modern medicine, science of medicine, we do not necessarily look for a mold infection in the sinuses, because our paradigm is to say, well, mold is the thing that's growing in your basement because you got water damage. We're not thinking of it as the thing that's infecting you, making you sick.
Yeah.
So if kind of going back to what you were saying a minute ago, where you were kind of distinguishing between maybe the common cold and maybe a mold-related thing, I heard a couple themes.
Mm-hmm.
Mold, if you have cold-like symptoms and they're mold, it's generally milder is kind of what I heard.
Yes.
Is that true?
At the front end, it's milder.
At the front end, but in the long term, it's kind of more of a chronic, not going away.
That's why I brought at the very beginning is the difference between a cold and mold is going to be chronicity. A cold is self-limiting. Even if you catch 2 colds back to back, there's still going to be time in between where you were better. And a cold is self-limiting, meaning it's going to last a maximum of 10 days.
Yeah.
This is assuming that somebody's normal. I mean, if you've got an immunocompromised problem, that's a different story. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
But regular people, I consulted with one family, and they moved into their home, and everybody's had a cold and or bronchitis and or a cough ever since they moved in. I'm like, well, okay, if it was bronchitis, it should have been self-limiting. Maximum, like, long-term bronchitis from an infection shouldn't last more than 2-3 weeks, maximum 6 weeks. It should have gotten better.
Yeah.
So now, this is the end of it. This is November, and they've been there since June.
Yeah.
Like, well, now at 5 months out, you still have colds? This isn't a cold anymore. That should have been done 5 months ago.
Yeah.
I said, well, is there anything else going on in your house? And like, well, yeah, this person has, a bunch of symptoms going on here, and this person has a bunch of symptoms going on here. I said, were any of those things happening before you moved into the house? No. These aren't. Okay, we can say that you have depression, and you might be depressed, but if you were never depressed prior to moving into this house, and you like this house, and you like what you're doing, something else shifted. Would I say depression or mold? Well, I'd say, well, you at least have to remove the mold and see if the depression gets better.
So is it true, because I've read this in some of the literature, I was reading it particularly in relation to depression, anxiety, but another mold doctor I read, he said antidepressants do not work well when it's mold-induced depression.
True.
It just isn't.
Yep.
Is that similar with cold flu if you're trying to treat those symptoms with the generic medicines?
No, because you're treating the symptoms of what causes the flu or the cold. I mean, you get a cold and your body says, ooh, that's bad, let's get rid of that. And so the reason you get symptoms is because your body's immune system is dealing with the thing you're trying to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
The cold itself doesn't cause symptoms, it's your body's response to the cold.
Yeah.
Same thing with the flu, same thing with whatever. And so as you got the cold, you take anti-cold medicines.
Mm-hmm.
They stop the symptoms. They block, it either blocks the histamine or whatever. The thing is a mold exposure is going to have a different set of chemical processes, and so while those symptoms might improve a little bit with those medicines or those therapies, you're still going to continue to have to take them over the course of more than 10 days. And you might, well, maybe it's allergies. Well, I scratch my head and go, well, did you have allergies before?
Yeah.
And because allergies are also have a chronicity to them, and they'll also have an environmental component. But
Yeah.
usually people aren't allergic to the indoor air; they're usually allergic to the outdoor air.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when people tell me they're having allergy type symptoms, a question I'll ask is, because sometimes people don't necessarily know, they can't find the correlation between the home and the symptoms, and so, but I will ask them, do these symptoms change? Because most people who have seasonal allergies they're seasonal. I mean, different seasons, right? They get worse and better. If they're fairly constant, I don't know if that's a good tactic, but I'll say, is it fairly constant? I mean, does it go up and down with the seasons? And if they say no, that steps me a little more in the direction of mold too. Is that good
or
logic?
if they, yes, that is good logic, because history is the most valuable tool that we physicians have in finding out the cause of the problem. We can run blood tests, but a blood test is like me saying, so do you have orange hair? And you say, no. Well, I didn't ask a nice open-ended question like, what color is your hair? I asked, do you have orange hair? So we can run a blood test. Do you have a normal complete blood count? And it comes back as, yes, you do. But I didn't ask if you have a B12 deficiency, because I had asked that. And so history kind of helps you to tease things out that give you more data, more information. If somebody has seasonal allergies, then they know in April when the ragweed is on, they're going to get allergies.
Yeah.
They just know that. But if all of a sudden in June they start getting symptoms again, like, well, am I allergic to something new? They scratch their head and it doesn't really fit.
Yeah.
Now, a complicating factor is if you're in a moldy home, that means everything you live with and in is also moldy. So it might not get better when you leave the house, because if you have mold spores on your clothing, then you took it with you.
Yeah.
Or if you have, if you've been sitting in your car and you have soft surfaces in your car instead of hard surfaces, so leather isn't going to hold it as well as, say, fabric. But you just came from a moldy home, you sat in that nice car of yours that has fabric seats, now you put that mold on your seats.
Yeah.
And so now when you're in your car, you have mold.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit harder to tease out, but usually when people are out of their homes, out of the environment, they do somewhat feel better, and that's an easier way to tease it out.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. We, at least I see this all the time, where people say, I moved because I had mold, and I still have mold. And two points on that is, one, it's really interesting how no matter how much you talk to the previous owner about, did you have water problems? Oh, of course not. We didn't have water problems. I swear, 9 times out of 10, they find out later there were water problems in that home. But the other thing that I was going to say is that you bring your stuff with you when you move, and that stuff has got all the mold on it.
Well, I have a solution for that. I say, number one, you need to leave. Take any stuff that you don't need, leave it. You don't need to take that with you. And then when you move into and I might be giving the wrong advice. Please correct me if I'm giving the wrong advice. But say when you move in, move everything into the garage, leave it open, and have your maintenance guys come in and fog everything, and then move it into the home so that you didn't contaminate the home.
Yeah, great advice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, we've fogged many possessions over the years. Even most recently, I fogged a couch where it was a secondhand couch. The guy was having his symptoms come up every time he sat on it. We'd already treated the home, but yeah, we fogged it, and he said symptoms went away when he sat on it. So
I treated this is years ago, but I treated a headboard that the mom had got real crafty, and she went and got some old barnwood and made a really cool headboard for her son. But every night he would have these symptoms, and she figured out it's the mold in the.
And therein again
barnwood.
Comes the history, taking a thorough history of saying every night he was having symptoms.
Right.
To me, that's a red flag. If you wake up with it and you didn't go to bed with it,
Yeah.
there's something you're sleeping with.
yeah.
Now, I haven't had to
Yeah.
tell that many people to perform a spousectomy, get rid of their spouse. But a lot of times it's in their bedding, or it's in their carpet, or it's in the clothes that they brought home, or something like that. Because if you didn't go to bed with it and you woke up with it, there's something in your bedroom was causing your problem.
Yeah.
So, kind of back to cold and flu. Are there any cold flu symptoms that a person could have that basically are all cold flu symptoms also symptoms that can be manifest with a mold sick person?
Usually, you're not going to get a high fever with a mold sick person. It's very unlikely, very atypical for a mold sick person.
Kind of a mild low one, but not a high one.
With a mold sick person, at best, they'll have a mild, or at worst, they'll have a mild fever.
Okay.
I've never seen or heard of anybody having a really high acute fever with a mold sick
With a mold
person.
sickness. But all the other ones?
Body aches and pains,
Yeah.
usually not mold. In the front end, at the back end, when somebody's been in and around a long time, it starts to look like fibromyalgia.
Yeah.
But that looks like fibromyalgia, not like an acute illness.
Yeah.
Usually a mold illness is going to focus in the respiratory tract, less in the eyes, and less in the throat. Although it can hit the throat, it's more likely to hit the respiratory tract, so nose, sinus, and lungs.
Interesting.
So if you have a sinus problem from mold or even from a cold, that drainage, I've always wondered this. Can that drainage cause a sore throat?
Yes.
Is it the bacteria that's now infesting in the throat that causes the sore throat? Or
It can be both. But if it's a mold problem and the mold is making biotoxins, the biotoxins are called that because they are toxic.
Right. Yeah.
And so if you're draining biotoxins down the back of the throat, those can hit the back of the throat and cause inflammation.
Okay. That makes sense. Years and years ago when we were first married, we had a home that had a flood, and I didn't know anything about mold. We just, get rid of the water and we should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember back then I had a chronic sore throat for, I want to say, a couple of years. And I look back now, it probably was that mold issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, so it sounds like, people can get tricked by a cold or a flu sometimes.
You can, but remember, if it's a cold or a flu, it's going to be self-limiting.
Yeah, if they do your checklist, they should be able to figure out this isn't a cold.
Yeah,
this
so
isn't flu.
you go, let's blame mold, but, it might take a week before I can get pure maintenance in to fog my house, so give it 10 days to 2 weeks, and if nothing changes, it's much more likely to be a mold problem.
Is there such a thing? I am going to say. So you've heard of people who have, what do they call it, long COVID or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Is there such a thing with flu or
Long
colds?
haulers? No.
There's no long flu, long cold.
No, you don't get long haulers from cold or flu.
Okay, so there's.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's other diseases, for example, Epstein-Barr, which causes, in some people, chronic fatigue syndrome. Epstein-Barr is, what's the virus that causes mono, and it can live in you forever. And I shouldn't say can, it does live in you forever. And it is something that can cause chronic fatigue and a lot of other symptoms. It usually comes on at the very beginning with a sore throat, the fever, and then it leaves you with the exhaustion for a year. And so that actually could, but that would, you'd think, I had the flu, and then you're tired afterwards. Like, well, it wasn't the flu virus that was making you sick; it was the Epstein-Barr.
Mm-hmm.
There's some people who are thinking that long hauler syndrome from COVID is actually just a reactivation of Epstein-Barr. And while I do think that is part of the equation for some people, I know other people that don't have Epstein-Barr that have long haulers.
Yeah.
So there's more to it than that.
There's more to it, yeah. And in all these things, it's complicated. As you've mentioned, I wish it was a little easier to determine. As I go into someone's house, I think I've mentioned this before, but I do try to do a profile of the person, especially kind of a medical one. And I'm learning from you and other people too, because I want to be able to not give them medical advice, but I want to be able to be confident in some of my inspection, as I ask them about the home and I hear about the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to tilt me one way or the other, and to make a more informed decision. Because as we've mentioned before, many times you don't see tons of active mold in a mold sick person's home, unfortunately. So
would be easy.
Yeah. Again, I wish it was a little easier. And I always recommend, if I'm sensing the symptoms, if I'm recognizing that the symptoms are aligning with all these things I've learned, I'm sending them to you. I'm sending them to another professional, that can do more of that side of things. But I think it's really good to know this stuff for anyone.
Yeah, I would say more times than not, when someone actually gets to the point where they call us, they've been battling these symptoms for months and months.
Yeah.
And that, in my mind, would rule out the common cold.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Many times we're getting the call when the person's like, I've had this thing for a long time, and I started Googling other things that cause these symptoms, and someone, some website said mold, so could you come check out my house? And that's usually when I, or any one of us shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does become this thing.
And I tell them every sickness is mold.
Yeah, and that's
Everything.
when you just tell
broken
them.
arm, that's mold.
I had a genetics professor who was of the opinion that everything was genetic.
Oh, really?
And we're like, broken arm, how's that genetic? And he said, well, genetically speaking, maybe you have less coordination, and or you had genetic inability to make awesomely strong bones instead of just strong bones. And all those things came together and you broke your arm. Well, what about the cold? Well, some people don't get the cold.
Yeah.
He said some people are just genetically susceptible to it. And so the reality of this is simply, yes, everything could be mold, but there's so many different factors. Do we go after mold first, or do we go after mold otherwise? In my practice, if I'm taking the history and, all your symptoms started after your water damage, I was like, well, look, I can run $2,000 worth of medical tests to prove that I think you have mold, or you can just call pure maintenance. And they're cheap by comparison.
Yeah, it's true.
And then once you have your house fogged, then we can talk about what you need to do afterward, because it's really, really hard, I found. It's really hard to dry off if you don't get out of the pool first.
Yeah. Okay, well, is there anything else that you can think of, Dr. Wright, like with this cold flu conversation, wintertime, anything? I don't know.
So with colds and flus, obviously take precautions. Wash your hands. Soap and water works beautifully. You don't have to necessarily use hand sanitizer. If you can't get out and use hand sanitizer, there's some great products out there. Alcohol is good for moving dirt around. It does kill the COVID virus. That's an okay hand sanitizer. There's other stuff. What's the stuff that you guys use? Gold Shield?
Gold Shield 5, yeah.
Gold Shield 5 is fantastic. Stuff called chlorhexidine that's fantastic. Anyway, using hand sanitizer, take precautions. If somebody's coughing up a lung, probably that's not a good time to let them play with your baby. It just doesn't make any sense to me that, somebody coughing up a lung deserves the opportunity to play with my baby. The basic things like that. Take precautions. Eat good food. It's really important. If you eat good quality food, you're going to have a much better ability to fight off viruses. Take your vitamin D. Low vitamin D is actually the cause of pretty much everything bad that happens in the world, and that's an overgeneralization.
Yeah.
But in our latitude and in Utah where we're based, the sun is not high enough in the sky from about October to about April for you to get vitamin D from the sun. So going sunbathing right now, even though it's freezing cold, probably isn't going to get the vitamin D you want.
I did not know that.
I didn't know
And
that
so
either.
therefore, pretty much everybody who lives in Utah needs to be taking a good amount of vitamin D. If you're a child, 500 to 1,000 is good. I take 10,000. I'm only 240 pounds, so I'm not that big of a guy, but probably to everybody listening, I'm probably a pretty big guy. But I take 10,000. And I just checked my vitamin D last week, and it was like 52. And it should be somewhere between, I like to see it between 40 and 60. So 10,000 is the sweet spot for me. I have yet to see somebody have an overdose on vitamin D. I've seen 2 people who started to get acute symptoms from it, but they were taking much higher doses for other reasons. So, for a regular person, 1 or 2,000 is a great start. You can get your doctor to check it. Taking your vitamin C. If you start getting a cold or flu, take some vitamin C. It just helps your body to get rid of the cold and flu faster. I'm not giving any medical advice. These are just basic things. If you Google other treatments for cold or flu, you're going to find these things.
Yeah.
But they're very safe. Even children can take these things and they're not harmful. They're just basic good sense. Yeah. Use your doctor if something goes bump and is really bad. If you don't know what to do, then go see your doctor. But with colds and flus, most people who have any kind of sense of the immune system can handle those just fine, and they don't necessarily need medical care. Now people are going to come and haunt you and by proxy haunt me saying, when should we see our doctor? Use good sense. If you feel like something's not right, talk to a professional.
And my big thing is water. Drink water.
Drink water.
Yeah, that's your
lots
big
of water.
thing.
Half your weight in ounces per day.
Half your
So-
weight.
Wait, okay. All right.
Oh,
So if you're
Okay.
200, so we'll do the math on me. If you're 240 ounces, I should be drinking 120 ounces of water per day. That's half my weight in ounces.
That is a significant amount
That's
of
a
water.
lot of water.
That's a lot of water.
you probably get close to that
Probably, yeah.
in energy drink
In
water.
a month, yeah.
But drinking water is important.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
it is.
found that.
Especially in the winter when it's not hot and you don't necessarily get that sense of hot thirst.
But homes are often very, very dry.
They
And so
are
often
dry,
we
yeah.
are more dehydrated in the wintertime
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
just the wonderful forced air that freezes.
Yeah, we don't notice it though. All right, any advice from you, Mike, on
No,
colds,
I-
flus?
No,
Drink water.
Sounds great. Drink water.
Drink water.
I've always said everybody should drink water.
Well, that's it for our December and Christmas week. This is Christmas week. This is
Yeah.
our Christmas week edition of the
Merry
Mold
Christmas
Matters.
to everyone.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
Merry
From
Christmas.
the Mold Matters podcast.
And don't eat too much
crew.
sugar.
Don't eat too much sugar. That's
And
another.
Thanks to our producer, Ari, behind the glass there.
Yeah, thanks, Ari.
Thank you.
All right, guys, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Mold Matters podcast. Be sure to subscribe for more in-depth information on mold illness and recovery.